Hello everyone. Welcome. Before the story begins, I'd truly appreciate your subscription to the channel, a like and a comment. I measure time in seconds now. Every time I walk past a window, every time my face catches in a car's side mirror, I start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I wait to see whether the reflection moves when I do. I've been doing that for, God, close to 2 years now. Since the mountains. Since Grant. And yeah, I know how it sounds. I know exactly what you're thinking. Either this guy's lost his mind, or he's winding up to tell some campfire ghost story he invented. But I'm not insane. And I wish to God I had made it all up. Because if I had, I'd still be able to sleep. I'd still be able to look into a mirror without feeling like my heart is trying to smash its way out of my chest. I'd still be able to stand beside a lake without the sick feeling that something beneath the ice is stretching up toward me. That's why I'm telling you. Someone has to know. Maybe saying it out loud will make it make sense. Maybe it won't. But here it is. I spent 12 years hauling flatlanders through the northern alpine basins. When you guide late-season elk hunts at 10,000 feet, nobody is paying you to be likable. They pay you to lay down the rules, read the sky, and make sure the person who hired you gets back to his truck still breathing. The mountains don't care how much money you have, what your status is, or how big your ego might be. They care about one thing only: mistakes. And I've watched grown men who run huge logistics firms, break down into helpless sobbing because their boots got soaked and the temperature dropped below zero. My job was keeping them alive when their own basic instincts stopped being useful. I took pride in that control. I trusted logic, preparation, and absolute obedience to the physical rules of the wilderness. Grant was my last client that season. He was a quiet one. Paid twice my normal rate, all in cash up front. Honestly, that should have been the first sign that something wasn't right. But money is money. He showed up at the trailhead wearing gear that still had hard factory folds pressed into the fabric. Brand new insulated boots that hadn't touched a mile of dirt. A spotless pack that looked like it had been lifted straight off a showroom rack. And he carried his custom-built rifle like it belonged behind museum glass. None of that mattered to me. As long as he could keep moving, stay quiet when we were tracking, and follow every instruction I gave without arguing, we were going to be fine. Truth is, I prefer the quiet ones. The talkers, the ones who try to pack every silence with stories about their suburban lives, are usually the same ones who start panicking and sucking air the minute the altitude gets into their lungs. We spent 2 punishing days climbing through dense, merciless timberline, pushing deep into an unnamed glacial basin where the air gets thin enough to make every breath burn. It was a brutal hike. You start low in the thick pines, where the ground is soft and springy with decades of fallen needles, then keep climbing until the trees turn twisted, stunted, starved for oxygen. After that come the scree slopes. Huge, dangerous fields of loose, broken granite where one bad shift of weight can send a rock crashing over your leg or snap your ankle clean in a second. I watched Grant closely the whole way up. Most men fresh off the street hit 8,000 feet and start gasping immediately. Their posture folds. Their pace falls apart. And every 20 minutes they ask how much farther. Grant never did any of that. He just kept walking. He didn't complain about the weight of his pack. He didn't slip on the loose rock. He didn't stumble once. He didn't even seem winded. At the time, I figured he was simply in better shape than he looked. Late 40s, average build, nothing athletic about him on the surface, but he matched my pace step for step without a single bead of sweat on his forehead. Late in the afternoon of the second day, we finally crossed the last ridgeline. The basin opened in front of us, a massive bowl-shaped depression gouged from solid granite by ancient glaciers. At the bottom lay the lake. Huge. Perfectly still. Black as spilled motor oil. The jagged peaks around it formed a natural windbreak, creating this unnatural, total silence that seemed to swallow every sound we made. No birds. No insects. Just every now and then, the distant crack of shifting ice bouncing off the canyon walls like a rifle shot. We pitched base camp on a flat shelf of rock above the water. The temperature dropped the instant the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. Not ordinary cold. Violent cold. The kind that freezes the warmth of your breath onto the inside of the tent, building a crust of frost that falls onto your face like snow if you brush the fabric in the dark. I got the heavy four-season tent up, anchored the guy lines to boulders because the ground was too hard frozen for stakes, and fired up the little pressurized stove to melt snow for drinking water. While the water heated, I sat Grant down and went over the rules. I do that with every client, but up there it isn't routine. It's survival. I pointed toward the black, frozen lake. Listen carefully, I told him, making sure he was looking right at me. Tomorrow morning we'll be skirting that shoreline to reach the northern feeding grounds. See that white shelf of ice along the bank? It looks solid, but it's a trap. Up here, the ice doesn't freeze evenly. I pointed again. There are deep, fast thermal currents running underneath near the shore. Ice over those currents can look thick, but it's weak. If you step on the wrong place, you don't just break through. The current takes your legs and pulls you under the solid sheet. I held his gaze. You'll be trapped beneath a ceiling of ice, and you'll drown in the dark before I can even unzip my pack. Grant kept staring at the lake, his face completely empty. No fear. No tension. The orange flicker from the stove lit his features and carved long, hard shadows across his cheekbones. So when we move, I said, stressing every word, you step exactly where I step. Not an inch off. If I step over a rock, you step over that exact rock. If I cut a zigzag path, you follow that exact zigzag. Do you understand? Slowly, he turned and looked at me. His eyes were dark, flat, impossible to read. The small blue flame of the stove reflected in them. I understand, Cole. I will step exactly where you step. We ate our dehydrated meals without talking and crawled into our sleeping bags. I slept badly that night. The altitude always throws off my internal clock for the first few nights. Strange dreams, broken sleep, a restless, uneasy feeling, a dull headache pulsing behind my eyes. I came awake at 4 a.m, a full hour before first light. The cold inside the tent was vicious. In the weak glow of my headlamp, my breath rolled out in thick white clouds. I went through the usual routine. Stove lit, survival gear checked, rifles cleared and inspected, magazines loaded. I fastened a small, cheap acrylic shaving mirror to the aluminum center pole of the tent. I use it every morning to look for the first signs of frostbite on my nose and cheeks. Up here, you can lose tissue from your face without feeling even the slightest stab of pain. Grant woke roughly 20 minutes later, sat straight upright in his sleeping bag, silent, and started lacing his boots. I poured boiling water through instant coffee grounds into 2 dented tin mugs and handed one to him. He was standing near the center pole, adjusting his collar. The warped acrylic mirror hung right beside his head, level with his shoulder. I watched him reach out and take the mug from my gloved hand. And when he did, my tired eyes drifted to the piece of plastic strapped to the pole. In the acrylic mirror, Grant's reflection was still standing straight, arms hanging loose at its sides, completely motionless. I stopped breathing. My brain just stalled. It couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Behind us, the pressurized camp stove kept hissing in its steady rhythm. The real Grant standing in front of me had already lifted the tin mug toward his mouth, blowing lightly across the steam. But in the mirror, his reflection had not moved at all. It just stood there, staring blankly ahead into the nylon wall. I stayed frozen, breath held, locked in a terrified trance on the warped plastic. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to look away, to dismiss it. But I couldn't. I started counting in my head. Slow. Even. Something to anchor myself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exactly at the 5th second, the reflection slowly lifted its arm, reaching into empty space, curling phantom fingers around a coffee mug that was no longer there, then bringing that empty hand up toward its face. It copied the exact movement Grant had made. Just 5 seconds late. I stared at the acrylic surface as nausea flooded through my whole body. My grip tightened around my own mug until my knuckles went white. My mind started clawing for rational explanations. Warped acrylic, cheap plastic distorting and delaying the light, extreme exhaustion, high-altitude hypoxia messing with my visual cortex, lack of oxygen can make people hallucinate, delayed cognitive processing. I've seen climbers swear they saw dead relatives standing in the snow. It was medical, a trick caused by awful lighting and an exhausted brain. It had to be. There was no other explanation I could live with. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes violently with my free hand, dragged in a desperate lungful of freezing air, and forced my heart rate to slow down. When I opened my eyes and looked back at the mirror, Grant's reflection was holding the mug to its lips, perfectly aligned with the real man standing beside it. "Drink up," I said, my voice sounding rougher and tighter than I meant it to. "We need to move before the sun hits the water and blinds us." Grant lowered his mug without a word. In the mirror, the reflection lowered its mug at the same time. The visual delay was gone. I angrily blamed the whole thing on altitude sickness, packed away the stove with hard, jerky movements, and told him to grab his rifle and get outside. We hiked down the steep, dangerous rocky slope toward the edge of the lake, just as the sun began to rise over the eastern ridge. The morning light struck the highest peaks first, turning the snow into a blinding white blaze, while the basin below stayed buried in deep blue shadow. The air was utterly still, so still you could hear the stiff fabric of your own jacket rubbing with every step. We reached the rocky shoreline. The water was perfectly, impossibly flat. A huge, flawless black mirror for the mountains around it. The unstable ice shelf I had warned him about stretched about 10 feet from the bank before dropping away into dark, freezing water. We stood on solid ground, frost crunching softly under our boots. Grant walked straight to the water's edge. He didn't step onto the weak ice, but stood only inches behind it, staring out over the vast surface. He bent down, his gloves scraping against frozen dirt, and picked up a smooth, rounded gray stone from the shore. Then he straightened, drew his arm back, and threw the stone toward the center of the lake. A sharp, solitary plunk. The stone broke the glassy surface, sending clean rings of ripples outward, warping the perfect reflection of the snow-covered peaks. I was standing about 10 feet off to his left, rifle hanging over my shoulder, both hands hooked into my pack straps. I wasn't watching the middle of the lake. I was staring straight down at the still water near the shoreline, where Grant's dark reflection lay clear across the surface. The reflection was just standing there, arms resting loosely at its sides, completely still. Every bit of air drained out of my lungs. The cold suddenly felt different, like it was punching straight through my insulated layers and settling deep into my bones. Every rational explanation I'd clung to inside the tent vanished. That had not been a warped sheet of cheap acrylic. This was a huge, perfectly flat natural body of water, bound by the laws of physics. I stared at the reflection, my heart pounding wildly against my ribs. I started counting again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exactly on the 5th second, the dark reflection bent down, reaching toward reflected ground, its dark hand closing around a stone that no longer physically existed. Then it straightened, drew its arm back, and made a perfect throwing motion. In the reflection, a phantom stone struck the surface. I watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as a second set of ripples spread outward on their own, distorting the reflected mountains in a way that had no physical source at all. The real water farther out was already calming from the actual splash, but the reflected water near the bank was only just beginning to move. Slowly, I lifted my eyes to the real Grant. He was standing completely motionless, looking out toward the center of the lake. His back was to me. He gave no sign that he had noticed what had just happened at his feet. Or worse, maybe he had noticed. Maybe he simply didn't care. I tightened my grip on the canvas sling of my rifle, feeling the rough material bite into my palm. I looked around at the sheer granite walls towering over us. 20 miles of dangerous timber between us and the nearest logging road. Completely alone. 10,000 feet up, and the man standing 10 feet away from me was fundamentally out of step with the physical world. I forced myself to stop looking at the water. If I stared too long, if I let the fear show on my face, he would know I had seen it. I had to stay in control out there. Control is the only thing that matters. I drew in a slow, deliberate breath through my nose, letting the freezing air burn down my throat, using the pain to pin down my spiraling thoughts. "I'm going to head back up to the treeline for a minute," I said, forcing my voice into the calm, authoritative tone I used a dozen times a day. "I need to glass the upper ridge for tracks before the sun gets too high. Stay here by the bank. Don't step on the ice." Grant slowly turned his head toward me. His expression was blank, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Take your time, Cole," he said. His voice sounded perfectly normal, quiet, slightly gravelly. "I'm just enjoying the view." I gave him a short nod, turned my back, and started up the steep incline toward camp. Every step took an enormous effort of will. Turning my back on him felt like laying my throat open in front of a predator. The hair on the back of my neck lifted, prickling against my wool collar. I kept expecting to hear boots grinding over gravel behind me. Kept expecting a sudden heavy impact. But the air stayed dead silent, broken only by the steady scrape of my own footsteps. I reached the cluster of weathered boulders where we had pitched the tent. The instant I was out of his sight, my professional mask collapsed. I dropped to one knee behind a slab of granite, chest heaving like I had just sprinted uphill, my hands shaking so violently I could barely work the buckles on my pack. I didn't care about the hunt anymore. I didn't care about the double rate he had paid. Something was deeply, catastrophically wrong with the man down by the water, and the only thing that mattered now was getting both of us off that mountain alive. I dug frantically into the bottom compartment of my pack, searching for the reinforced waterproof hardshell case that held my satellite phone. My lifeline. Up there, cell service is a fairy tale. Standard radios are useless against granite walls. If a client snaps a leg or drops from a heart attack, that phone is the only thing standing between him and a slow, miserable death. My gloves scraped against the familiar shape of the hard plastic case. I yanked it out, my thumb reaching for the latches. The latches were already broken. My stomach dropped. I tore off my right glove with my teeth and forced the damaged case open with bare, trembling fingers. The satellite phone inside was destroyed. Not dropped. Destroyed. The thick rubber antenna had been ripped off the main body. Jagged wires stuck out like severed veins. The screen was crushed into a spiderweb of white dust and shattered glass. The keypad had been caved inward, the circuitry underneath smashed into useless ruin. I stared at the wrecked phone, my mind racing. That case was nearly indestructible. You could run it over with a forestry truck and barely mark it. The amount of force it would take to crush the phone inside it was enormous. Everything all right back there, Cole? I flinched violently, my shoulder slamming into the cold granite. Grant was standing on the other side of the rocks, looking straight down at me. I had never heard him approach. The ground around camp was nothing but loose, broken scree. Walking across it sounds like marching over shattered glass. It is physically impossible for a grown man carrying gear to cross that ground without making noise. And yet Grant had covered 30 yards from the shoreline in complete silence. No crunch of gravel. No sound of breathing. He had simply appeared. I froze, my bare hands still resting on the crushed phone. I looked up into his flat, dark eyes, trying desperately to find some hint of malice there. There was nothing. Only a strange, hollow emptiness. Phone's busted, I said, keeping my voice level, fighting the urge to yank the sidearm from the holster strapped to my chest. I held up the ruined device and watched his face for any reaction. Grant tipped his head slightly. The movement was incredibly smooth. Too smooth. Like a camera turning on a greased tripod. My pack slipped last night while I was pulling out my sleeping bag, he said, his tone casual, almost apologetic. Must have landed right on your case. Didn't realize it had done any damage. My apologies, Cole. I'll pay for the replacement once we're back in town. For now, let's stay focused on the hunt. He was lying. Smooth lie. Logical lie. Perfectly delivered lie. But physically impossible. The case with my satellite phone had been packed at the very bottom of my own bag, buried under layers of clothes and gear. His pack could not have slipped and landed on it. Someone had to dig through my bag on purpose, open the case, deliberately crush the phone, and pack everything back away while I slept. He was cutting us off from the outside world. I swallowed against the dry knot in my throat and nodded, forcing a tight professional smile that felt like it might crack across my frozen face. Right, I said, putting the useless plastic back into my pack. Things happen in the backcountry. We'll just have to be extra careful. Let's move. The herd's probably bedding down in the high timber on the northern ridge. We spent the next 3 hours climbing higher into the basin. The pressure in my chest sat there like a suffocating weight. I kept Grant walking about 15 feet ahead of me, using the excuse that I needed to watch our back trail in case mountain lions tried to flank us. In reality, I could not stand the thought of him behind me. And as we climbed, I began watching him with obsessive intensity. When you've guided for more than a decade, you learn to read a man's gait like a page of text. You see the tiny corrections when knees begin to ache. You notice shoulders starting to sag under the weight of a pack. You hear the ragged rhythm of breathing when altitude starts starving the blood of oxygen. A human body fighting gravity at 10,000 feet is loud, clumsy, and inefficient. Grant showed none of it. He moved up the steep 45-degree grade of loose talus with a kind of fluid mechanical precision. His heavy boots landed flat on jagged rock every time, never slipping, never sending loose stones skittering. His spine stayed perfectly straight, untouched by the weight of his pack. He wasn't panting. He wasn't sweating. The back of his neck was bone-dry despite the brutal effort. It was the uncanny valley made real in the worst possible way. He looked human, wore human clothes, carried human gear. But the mechanics underneath were wrong. Fundamentally wrong. Like watching a highly advanced machine wrapped in a suit made of skin. A sick, sinking dread came over me. I understood then that I wasn't guiding some rich client. I was following an apex predator, something highly adapted that had copied its prey perfectly. As we kept moving, my mind jolted back to something that had happened the afternoon before. We had been picking our way through a narrow, dangerous chute beneath a towering rock wall. The granite above us was rotten, split apart by years of freezing and thawing. I was in front when I heard it. A sharp, violent crack from the cliff overhead. Falling rock. I threw myself against the canyon wall, covering my head and shouting a warning. A huge cloud of granite dust came boiling down, blinding me for several seconds. When the dust finally cleared, I turned around expecting the worst. Grant was standing there, casually brushing dust from his shoulder. He looked at me with mild, unconcerned eyes and calmly said that a rock had only grazed him. He seemed fine. I had closed the distance immediately, checking his pupils, asking him cognitive questions, running my hands over his collarbone to feel for fractures. He passed everything. His gear wasn't ripped. He wasn't bleeding. He wasn't dizzy. I had let out a huge breath of relief, written it off as a lucky near miss, and we had kept going. Now, watching this impossible thing move up the mountain, that memory changed shape inside my head. It became something dark, something horrifying. Just before noon, we reached a high plateau scoured bare by the wind. The sun was brutally bright, glaring off scattered snowfields with a flat, hostile intensity. Most of the ground was solid bedrock, worn smooth by ancient glaciers. Near the center of the plateau, the sun had melted out a broad, shallow basin in the stone, and runoff had collected there. The freezing air had turned it into a thick sheet of dark, polished ice, swept clean of snow by the relentless wind. It looked like a massive slab of black glass set into the rock. Grant never changed pace. He walked straight out onto the frozen surface, his boots giving off soft crunches against the smooth ice. I stopped cold at the rocky edge. My legs would not move. My eyes locked onto the dark ice beneath his boots. I already knew what I was going to see, and every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to turn and run. But I needed to know. I needed confirmation. I needed to understand the impossible rules. I watched his real boots step onto the center of the ice. My breath caught hard in my chest. I began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exactly on the 5th second, the dark reflection stepped forward, matching his movement perfectly. But the instant the image fully took shape in the polished ice, all the breath left my body. The reflection wasn't only delayed. It was showing the truth. The real Grant standing on the ice wore a clean, bright orange hunting beanie. His posture was tall, straight, but the reflection in the black ice was bareheaded. Its hair was thickly clotted with dark frozen blood and gray granite dust ground into it. The entire left side of the skull was crushed inward, a huge jagged fatal collapse exposing broken white bone and ruined flesh. The neck was twisted at a nauseating angle. The eyes were glassy, rolled back, utterly dead. My stomach dropped out. The rock had not grazed him yesterday. The falling granite had struck him square in the head, smashed his skull, and killed him instantly. The real Grant had died on that mountain 24 hours earlier. The thing walking in front of me, wearing his clothes and speaking in his voice, was only a hollow local projection. A disguise. And the reflection trailing 5 seconds behind was the creature's true physical anchor, dragging the brutal reality of the corpse it was imitating through space-time. I stood frozen at the edge of the ice while the wind screamed across the plateau. The physical projection of Grant stopped walking and stood in the middle of the frozen puddle. He didn't turn. He just stood there with his back to me. Then, slowly and with deliberate purpose, his hands rose and closed around the bolt of his hunting rifle. A sharp metallic clack rang out across the silent plateau as he chambered around. I didn't run. Out in the backcountry, if you turn and sprint, you trigger something ancient in whatever is watching. You stop being a threat. You become prey. My hand hovered near the holster on my chest, fingers twitching with the urge to draw and dump the entire magazine into his back. But my training was screaming at me to stay still. If I drew, I would be forcing a confrontation with no cover at all. And I still didn't understand the rules of the thing standing in front of me. I made myself pull my hand away from the holster. I grabbed the sling of my rifle instead, took one slow, measured breath of freezing air, and used the hard voice I saved for reckless clients right before they got themselves killed. "Safety on, Grant," I ordered, my tone flat and hard. "We do not chamber around until we have eyes on a confirmed target. You know the rules. Clear the chamber and put the safety back on. Now." The projection didn't flinch, didn't startle. It stood perfectly still, impossibly still, for one long agonizing moment. Then, with that same awful mechanical smoothness, the entity slowly turned to face me. There was no human hesitation in it, no friction. It moved like a heavy steel door swinging on a greased hinge. "Just preparing coal," the entity said. The voice had Grant's exact pitch, the exact same gravel in it, but there was no emotion inside it at all. Perfectly flat. "The air is getting very thin up here. Things move fast at this elevation. I just want to be ready." I kept my eyes fixed on the projection, but at the edge of my vision I caught movement in the ice below, exactly 5 seconds after the physical body had turned. The dark, broken reflection slowly rotated to face me. Even through the distortion of the ice, I could see the smashed skull, the clotted hair, the dead glassy eyes staring sightlessly up from the frozen black. The creature's true mass was dragging itself through space-time, tied to the physical world only by light reflecting off its grotesque stolen template. "Clear the chamber," I repeated, my voice dropping lower, hiding the terror that was trying to lock my throat shut. The entity looked at me with Grant's face. Its eyes were empty, missing the tiny shifts of focus that make a human gaze feel alive. Slowly it lifted the rifle, drew back the bolt, caught the live cartridge as it kicked free, slipped the round into its pocket, and pushed the safety forward with a sharp click. "Done," the entity said. "Good," I answered, taking one slow, careful step backward off the rocky edge until solid granite was under my boots again. "Let's glass the treeline. We're too exposed out here. Get off the ice and move toward that stand of dead pines on the western ridge. You take the left. I'll take the right." I needed space. Needed a reason to observe it through something else. The entity obeyed without speaking. It walked off the frozen puddle, boots crunching across scree, and headed toward the ridge. I stayed back, keeping about 30 yards between us, my eyes flicking between the physical body and the ground beneath it, terrified of seeing another glimpse of that delayed shadow. We reached the edge of the plateau, where the ground fell away into a steep wooded ravine. Dead lodgepole pines stood there like gray spears against the snowfields. The wind rose, moaning through the dead branches with a thin, mournful whistle. The entity raised its binoculars and began scanning the timberline below. I unclipped the pouch on my chest rig and pulled out my thermal monocular. Military-grade hardware. I used it to track the heat signatures of wounded elk through dense brush. At 10,000 feet, with the ambient air hovering around 32 degrees, a living human body at 98 degrees shows up on that screen like a blinding white sun against deep blue darkness. I pressed the cold rubber eye cup against my eye and powered the unit on. The screen flickered to life, painting the landscape in harsh, high-contrast bands of black and dark blue. I slowly swept the lens across the ravine, pretending I was looking for animals. I took my time, letting the unit establish a baseline temperature, letting the software calibrate. Then, in one smooth motion, I moved the thermal lens directly over the entity standing 30 yards to my left. The screen showed nothing. I froze. My finger hovered over the zoom button. I blinked, thinking the cold must have made the unit malfunction. I lowered the monocular, looked directly at the real Grant in his bright orange beanie and heavy jacket, then raised the lens to my eye again. Still nothing. No white heat bloom. No bleed of warmth. Only deep freezing blue. The entity gave off no body heat. It was exactly 32 degrees, matching the frozen granite and the dead timber perfectly, not producing a single trace of biological warmth. A cold, paralyzing dread poured through my nervous system and settled deep in my gut. I lowered the monocular, my hands shaking so violently I had to brace it against my chest to steady myself. Then I understood. The physical body was not real. It was a lightweight projection, an absurdly complex, highly localized optical illusion. No mass, no heat, no internal biological function. Just a hollow three-dimensional photograph draped over empty air. But the reflection, the delayed reflection in the acrylic mirror and the frozen ice, that was the entity's real physical anchor. That was the true, dense, horrifying mass trying to move through physics. Light took 5 seconds longer to return from its actual form, because the thing was dragging its enormous weight through local space-time. The projection was only bait, a fast-moving decoy designed to calm prey. The real monster was always 5 seconds behind, crawling unseen through the air, chained to visual echoes. "I think we should head back to camp," I said, my voice tight and strained now, the professional guide persona starting to peel away. I took a careful step backward, moving my hand toward the holster. "The weather's shifting. We're losing light, and I don't like that cloud bank over the eastern peaks." The entity didn't lower its binoculars, didn't turn. It only stood there, looking into the dark ravine. "We haven't found what we're looking for yet," Grant's voice said. But the voice did not come from the projection standing 30 yards away. It came from the empty air directly beside my right ear. I flinched so hard I nearly twisted sideways, my heart slamming against my ribs. There was nothing there, only freezing wind and empty stone. But the words had been so close I could feel the air move against my cheek. I snapped my head back toward the entity and started counting, my mind spiraling in absolute terror. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exactly on the 5th second, the projection 30 yards away slowly lowered its binoculars. Its jaw opened, its lips moved, and it formed the exact words I had already heard whispered into my ear. "We haven't found what we're looking for yet." The illusion was failing. The entity was working across multiple broken layers of time, losing its grip on the physics of its disguise. Its sound had detached from its image. The voice was arriving in real time, generated by the invisible true mass hovering right beside me, while the visual decoy lagged 30 yards away, acting out words already spoken. I was standing next to the real thing. "I'm calling the hunt," I said, my voice shaking now, unable to hide the fear anymore. I took another desperate step backward, moving blindly toward the steep lip of the plateau. I didn't care about the drop. I just needed distance from the empty space beside my head. "The trip is over. We're packing up and heading down now." "You're walking too fast, Cole," the voice whispered. This time it did not come from beside me. It came from directly behind my head, from the base of my skull. Thick, wet, completely stripped of human inflection. I felt the air pressure drop hard, like a heavy vacuum forming against the back of my neck. I spun, drawing my sidearm in one frantic motion, brought the sights up on the empty space behind me, and took the slack out of the trigger. Nothing, only blinding white snow and gray granite. I kept the pistol up, arms trembling, and backed away, putting 10 feet between myself and the place where the voice had come from. Then I looked back toward the projection standing by the dead pines 30 yards away. I counted. 3, 4, 5. The projection slowly turned its head and looked straight at me. Its lips parted. "You're walking too fast, Cole." And this time it smiled. Wide. Horrific. Completely wrong. The facial muscles stretched too far. Skin pulled tight over the cheekbones. The mouth spread beyond human limits. The lips peeled back to show perfect white teeth. The dead glassy eyes never moved. They stayed locked on my face with a predator's focus. It was not a human smile. It was a predator baring its teeth at prey that had finally understood it was trapped. It knew exactly what I had figured out. The delay. The missing heat. The split between sound and image. The game was over. The entity was done pretending. The projection opened its hands and let the custom rifle fall. The weapon clattered against the rocks, but the projection didn't react. It didn't need the rifle. Its physical outline began to blur and shiver at the edges. Color bled into the gray background like wet watercolor in rain. Its human proportions started to stretch. Limbs lengthened. The spine bent at impossible angles as the illusion fought to hold itself together. "Run, Cole," the thick, wet voice echoed. It didn't come from the projection. It came from the rocks, the sky, the freezing wind itself. The sound rebounded off the granite walls around me in a disorienting swarm of overlapping, delayed echoes. I didn't wait 5 seconds. I didn't wait to see the blurred lips shape the command. I turned, jammed the pistol back into its holster, and sprinted blindly for the treeline. I hit the scree slope at full speed. It was a reckless descent, desperate and uncontrolled, so close to suicide it barely counted as survival. Running down a 45-degree grade of loose, frost-heaved granite isn't really running. It's a violent chain of controlled slips. Every time my boots struck, sheets of stone broke loose and cascaded down the ravine. I was sliding, catching myself for fractions of seconds, pushing off unstable rock, then dropping again. My knees took impacts hard enough to threaten the joints. At 10,000 feet, a sprint turns your lungs into frantic bellows, trying to drag oxygen out of air too thin and too cold to give enough. My chest burned with metallic agony. The taste in my mouth was cold copper and rock dust. The wind tore tears from my eyes and froze them to my cheeks, blurring my vision. I didn't care about the noise. I didn't care that every skidding boulder was announcing exactly where I was. I only needed distance, needed jagged vertical ground between my body and the invisible mass that had been hovering inches from my neck. I risked one glance back over my shoulder. The projection of Grant was gliding straight down the slope behind me, but the disguise was breaking apart badly. It wasn't stepping over rocks. It wasn't shifting weight. It was simply moving in a straight, smooth downward line, ignoring the laws of terrain. The orange beanie and camouflage pattern were smearing backward through the air like digital artifacts lagging across a corrupted screen. The human face was gone, replaced by a melting, featureless blur of shifting flesh tones locked with mechanical precision onto my fleeing position. But the worst part was not what I saw. It was what I heard. Exactly 5 seconds behind the silent projection, the mountain itself was being ripped apart. Huge granite boulders were being crushed, ground to powder, shoved aside by an invisible gravitational force. Stone grinding, deadwood snapping, earth shifting. All of it followed the path the projection had occupied 5 seconds earlier. The true mass was moving like an invisible bulldozer, carving a trench down the ravine as it chased the visual anchor it projected ahead of itself. It was hunting me across 2 timelines. The visual projection was there to draw the eye. The real physical monster dragged its crushing weight through reality 5 seconds in the past. I needed to slow it down, needed to break line of sight, needed to disappear into the timber below. I hit a relatively flat shelf of solid bedrock and dropped hard to one knee, ignoring the electric bolt of pain that shot through me. My breathing rasped in my ears like wet sandpaper. Then muscle memory took over. I swung the rifle off my shoulder and brought the cold stock to my cheek. I didn't bother with the optics. The entity was within 50 yards and closing fast. I sighted straight down the barrel with both eyes open, aiming center mass at the gliding, smeared projection. I knew the projection was only manipulated light, but I prayed that if I disrupted the visual anchor, maybe the invisible mass would lose orientation. I exhaled hard, held what breath I had left to steady the shot, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the .300 Winchester Magnum slammed off the canyon walls, briefly drowning out the grinding stone behind it. I saw the round hit the projection square in the chest. No impact, no blood, no resistance, no kinetic shock. The blurred fabric only rippled, like a stone passing through a beam of light on a movie screen. The bullet went straight through and shattered a granite boulder 20 yards behind it in an explosion of dust. You can't kill a shadow by shooting the wall it falls on. Weapons made to tear apart living tissue meant nothing against a localized distortion of space-time. I chambered another round in a frantic metallic scramble, my hands shaking so badly I almost jammed the bolt. I fired again, aiming lower this time, hoping I might hit the invisible mass trailing 5 seconds behind. The round struck scree and ricocheted away into empty air. I ripped the bolt back a 3rd time, but the action locked open against the empty follower. Primary magazine empty. I let the rifle drop to hang against my heaving chest and scrambled backward off the outcropping, cut away now from the main trail. The entity's pursuit had driven me sideways across the face of the ravine, forcing me toward a feature I had wanted to avoid from the start. The terrain pinched sharply downward, narrowing into a dark, twisting slot canyon. Its walls were sheer, polished granite, rising 50 feet straight up on both sides, carved smooth by years of glacial runoff. There was no climbing out sideways without technical gear and hours I did not have. Once you went into that chute, you were committed to following it all the way to the bottom. I hit the mouth of the slot canyon at a full sprint. My boots skidded on wet, permanently shadowed stone. The temperature inside dropped 10 degrees immediately, cut off from the sun. The bottom wasn't gravel or rock. It was one continuous strip of dark, polished ice. A frozen underground runoff stream winding downward toward the main lake. I slammed onto the ice, boots clawing for traction, arms pinwheeling as I slid deeper into the narrow, suffocating corridor. I had been driven here. The entity hadn't been chasing me at random. It had steered me, calculating the pursuit to funnel me into a natural kill box. I drew my sidearm, thumb snapping off the safety, and raised the weapon as I backed slowly down the frozen channel. The granite walls pressed inward, narrowing to barely 8 feet across, trapping me in a tunnel of ice and stone. Then the grinding noise outside stopped. For one suffocating moment, the only sound was my own harsh breathing bouncing off the rock. Then the projection dropped soundlessly into the entrance of the canyon. The disguise was failing completely now. Its face had become a melted, featureless smear of shifting flesh tones, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Its limbs were stretching beyond natural proportions. Its arms hung below its knees. The fingers tapered into blurred, wavering points. "Nowhere left, Cole." The voice echoed. It did not come from the projection. It ricocheted off the granite walls, surrounding me in a disorienting chorus. The acoustic desync was complete. The entity was enclosing me with sound while sending its decoy ahead. I backed up, my boots sliding until my shoulders struck solid stone. I risked a glance behind me. The frozen stream ended in a sheer vertical drop. A frozen waterfall, 20 feet down onto jagged rock. Trapped, backed against a cliff, out of rifle rounds, boxed into an inescapable canyon, being hunted by something that violated physics. The blurred projection moved closer, gliding over the black ice without moving its legs, one stretched arm rising toward my face. The air filled with the smell of burning ozone and stagnant water. Pressure built inside my ears as space-time warped. I leveled the sidearm at the melting shape, knowing hollow points would do nothing, but unable to give up. Then my eyes dropped to the darkness under my feet. I looked down at the polished ice. The reflection was there, not a blurred projection. Through the dark surface, I could see the true, unfiltered reality. A massive, dense body of shifting segmented darkness, plated in thick armor that drank in light, crawling along the underside of the ice on multiple jointed limbs, dragging its enormous bulk forward with mechanical strength. Exactly 5 seconds behind the projection in front of me. And suddenly I saw it clearly. The projection was only 2 feet away, its blurred hand reaching for my throat, ozone burning through my senses. But in the ice, the real mass was still 10 feet back, slowly hauling its weight through the frozen channel. The reflection was the anchor, the only place where the entity physically touched light, mass, and the laws of reality. The cheap acrylic mirror in the tent, the frozen puddle on the plateau, the black ice in the canyon. It used reflective surfaces to tether its displaced mass to the world. I looked at the ice between my boots and the approaching shadow. I knew this canyon intimately. I'd guided clients through it for a decade. I knew every hazard in it. 10 feet away, right where the shadow was pulling itself into place, the ice formed a dangerously thin bridge over a deep, fast-moving thermal current. The weakest point in the whole frozen channel. A trap waiting to collapse. I didn't need to shoot the projection. I needed to break the anchor that was tethering the real mass to the ice. I stared at the dark shadow moving over that fragile thermal current, tightened my grip on the pistol, and realized I had exactly 5 seconds. I did not aim at the projection. I knew pulling the trigger would be loud and useless. I holstered the weapon in one swift motion, snapping the thumb brake shut. My eyes never left the ice. I reached down and unclipped my climbing axe. Solid, one-piece high-carbon steel, built to bite deep into glacial ice and hold the full weight of a falling climber. The handle, wrapped in heavy rubber, grounded in my shaking hand. Simple, primitive physics. Massachusetts leverage. Hardened steel. The projection was less than 2 feet away now. The disguise was coming apart completely. Its visual fidelity had collapsed into a horrifying smear. The temperature in the air was dropping so fast that moisture crystallized into hanging mist. The smell of ozone and stagnant water scorched my sinuses. Pressure kept building in my ears. The same feeling as a massive barometric front before a violent thunderstorm. Reality straining under impossible gravitational stress. But I forced myself to ignore all of it, locked my focus on the dark segmented shadow crawling beneath the frozen stream. 1. The reflection dragged its huge front limbs forward. I heard the thick ice groan under the weight. Even though the surface above it was empty, the entity was incredibly heavy. 2. I shifted my stance, widening my base on the slick surface. I did not step backward. I stepped forward, directly into the space occupied by the wavering projection. The instant I crossed into it, I plunged into freezing vacuum. It felt like stepping into a deep freezer. The projection offered no resistance. It split around my shoulders like cold fog. 3. I raised the climbing axe high over my shoulder. My muscles coiled tight, burning with adrenaline. I kept my eyes fixed on the ice. I knew exactly where the thermal current moved under the surface. I had mapped that hazard a dozen times. A narrow, aggressive underground channel, always rushing with freezing, high-pressure meltwater. The ice spanning that current was dangerously thin. 4. The huge reflection crawled directly over the thermal current. Its center of mass settled perfectly over the weakest section, fully tethered to that optical point. It could not move the physical mass without moving the reflection first. The mirror was its anchor. The reflection was the only place where it touched light and mass. 5. I didn't strike the entity. I drove every ounce of weight, every ounce of fear, every scrap of strength I had left straight down into the ice. The hardened steel pick hit the dark surface dead center over the crawling reflection. The impact was savage, sending a violent shock up the shaft, through my forearms, into my shoulders. The ice didn't crack. It exploded. A deafening concussive boom slammed through the canyon, echoing off the granite walls like an enormous sheet of architectural glass shattering. A dense web of white fracture lines blasted outward from the point of impact, destroying the smooth black surface. I ripped the axe free and drove it down again into the same compromised spot. This time the structure failed completely. A huge jagged section of frozen surface, 6 feet across, collapsed into the rushing black current below. The reflective surface shattered into thousands of fragments, destroying the visual anchor the entity had used to bind itself to reality. The instant the reflection broke, the projection made a sound I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't an animal scream. It was the mechanical shriek of tearing sheet metal layered with high-pitched feedback so violent it made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Without its visual anchor, the entity lost its hold on reality. Gravity snapped back into place, its true enormous invisible weight localized directly over the broken hole in the ice. I watched in frozen horror as the empty space above the collapse folded inward on itself. The air warped, bent. The invisible mass plunged straight down into the freezing, turbulent water. The projection of Grant vanished instantly. It did not fade. It blinked out of existence like a blown bulb. The water under the ice churned violently. A massive splash burst out of the broken opening, spraying freezing black water across my boots. The thermal current was unbelievably strong, a relentless high-pressure funnel of glacial runoff. I heard the heavy invisible mass slam into the frozen ceiling from underneath, scraping and grinding as the current caught it and dragged it away. Then came the muffled, horrible sound of the creature being pulled helplessly down the dark channel, growing fainter as it was carried toward the lightless depths of the alpine lake. And then the canyon went quiet. Not oppressive silence, not waiting silence, just the normal cold emptiness of deep wilderness. The only sounds left were the steady rush of water under the broken ice and the ragged wheeze of my own exhausted lungs. Then the adrenaline crash hit. My legs gave out. I collapsed onto the solid ice, gasping for air, my gloved hands clamped around the axe, so hard I couldn't make them release it. The cold seeped through my pants, but I could not force my body to move. I sat there in the dim gloom for a full hour, staring blankly at the black water visible through the shattered hole, waiting for the surface to freeze over again, waiting for a hand to come out, waiting for a voice to whisper from the granite walls. Nothing happened. The mountain was only a mountain again. But my survival situation had shifted from terrifying to catastrophic. I was sitting on a frozen stream at 10,000 feet, miles from any trail. The temperature was steadily falling as the afternoon sun dropped behind the western peaks. My pack, sleeping bag, stove, and rations were all abandoned back on the high plateau. All I still had was my chest rig, a few protein bars, my sidearm, the climbing axe, and the clothes on my back. Going back up the scree slope for the rest of my gear was impossible in the condition I was in, and returning to the place where the entity had let the disguise fail was a psychological line I could not cross. I would rather have frozen in the timber than walk back onto that flat, reflective rock. I forced my stiff joints to straighten, got to my feet, leaning on the axe like a cane, and started the long, brutal walk out. I did not follow the frozen stream down to the lake. I refused to go near any continuous reflective surface. Instead, I spent 2 agonizing hours free climbing the steep, jagged sidewall of the canyon, sinking the steel pick into rotten granite and hauling myself upward until I finally broke over the top and collapsed into dense timberline. The hike out took 3 days, a grueling, hallucinatory descent into physical and mental collapse. I walked through the entire first night, using weak moonlight to navigate through the heavy pines, terrified that if I stopped moving, the cold would lower my core temperature until my heart quit. I chewed dry protein bars until my jaw ached, letting those miserable calories keep my shaking muscles working. Dehydration became the main enemy. The mountain was full of clean snowmelt and hundreds of glassy alpine puddles, but I refused to look into them. I would not go near still water. The thought alone of catching my own reflection, of seeing my face staring back and waiting to find out if it moved when it should, was enough to make my chest lock up in panic. So instead I scooped up handfuls of dry snow, packed them into my gloves, and let my body heat melt them into a few miserable drops I could lick from the fabric. It was wildly inefficient. It lowered my core temperature even further, but it kept my organs working just enough for me to keep moving. By the afternoon of the second day, sleep deprivation had started playing vicious tricks on me. Every tall dead pine in the edge of my vision looked like a stretching figure. Every gust of wind sounded like Grant's flat voice whispering my name. I walked with my sidearm drawn, finger hovering near the trigger, constantly spinning to check my back trail, aiming at shadows and empty brush. Paranoid, exhausted, a broken shell stumbling down steep slopes, driven by one primal refusal. I was not going to die in that basin. On the morning of the third day, the timber finally began to thin. The steep incline softened into rolling foothills. I smelled sharp diesel exhaust before I heard the engine. Then I stumbled out of the brush and nearly fell onto the flat, graded gravel of a logging road. A huge forestry truck loaded with fresh-cut timber was grinding slowly uphill. I stood in the middle of the dirt road, waving both arms wildly, the climbing axe dangling from my wrist. The truck shrieked to a stop, air brakes hissing. The driver, a thick-built bearded man in a high-visibility vest, threw open the door and jumped down, eyes wide in shock. I must have looked like a corpse walking. My lips were cracked and bleeding. My face was hollow and burned raw by the wind. My eyes were sunken deep in dark sockets. "Jesus Christ, buddy," the driver shouted, running toward me. "You all right? Where's your camp? Did you get turned around?" I didn't answer. I let him grab my arm and practically carry me to the passenger side of the warm cab. He hoisted me inside, cranked the heater to full blast, and handed me a dented thermos of lukewarm stale coffee. I drank it greedily, not caring that it burned my split throat. "I've got a radio in here," the driver said, climbing back into the cab and grabbing a coiled microphone. "I'm calling county sheriff and search and rescue." "Who are we looking for? How many are still up there?" I stared out through the dusty windshield at the towering peaks shrinking away in the rearview mirror. I thought about the crushed satellite phone, the fatal depression in Grant's skull, the heavy armored mass crawling along the underside of the frozen stream. You do not tell a county sheriff that a space-time anomaly wearing a dead man's face chased you through a canyon. You do not tell search and rescue that the mountains are infested with apex mimics using local light physics. If you tell the truth, they do not send a recovery team. They lock you in a white room with padded walls, flood your veins with sedatives, and write you off as another tragic victim of altitude psychosis. The mountain keeps its secrets, and if you want to keep living among sane people, you keep them too. It's just one, I rasped, my voice sounding like crushed gravel. Grant, my client. We had been navigating a steep scree slope above the main basin. I paused, swallowed hard, and forced the lie to solidify. He lost his footing, slid down the talus, and fell into a deep thermal vent in the ice near the shoreline. The current was too strong. It pulled him straight under the ice shelf. I couldn't reach him. He's gone. The driver stared at me, pale, then slowly nodded. He keyed the microphone and relayed the coordinates and the tragic, logical story to dispatch. What followed was a long, exhausting bureaucratic nightmare. 3 days in brightly lit rooms at the county sheriff's office, repeating the same lie to deputies, park rangers, and eventually the aggressive lawyers representing Grant's wealthy, grieving family. I drew maps, pointed to coordinates on charts, explained the structural mechanics of weak ice over thermal currents, repeated the exact warning I had given Grant on our first night. It was flawless, undeniable, a story that fit the brutal logic of alpine wilderness perfectly. Search and rescue spent 2 weeks combing the basin. They found our abandoned base camp. They found the crushed satellite phone and assumed it had belonged to a panicked guide trying desperately to save his client. They deployed remotely operated submersibles into the black depths, scanning underwater currents and rocky crevices. They never found a body. Eventually the authorities ended the search, officially ruling it a tragic wilderness accident. File closed. Insurance paid. The world moved on. I don't guide anymore. I never renewed my license. I sold every piece of alpine gear I owned. I couldn't stand the idea of ever stepping above timberline again. I moved out of the high country, relocated to a flat, dry, dusty farming valley in the Midwest. Now I work a quiet job maintaining heavy diesel equipment for an industrial agriculture company. I spend my days covered in grease and oil, turning wrenches on giant machines that obey strict, unquestionable mechanical laws. A simple life, a grounded life, a boring life, and I am profoundly grateful for it. But the wilderness does not simply let you go. When you encounter something that shatters your understanding of the universe at its foundation, it takes a vital piece of your mind and rewires it forever. Trauma is not just memory. It becomes a lens, the thing you look through for the rest of your life. I live quietly now. My days are structured, predictable, but anyone who stepped into my house would know immediately that something is very wrong. There are no mirrors anywhere in my home. The large bathroom mirror was unbolted and thrown into a landfill the day I moved in. I shave by memory and touch. Every window is covered with heavy blackout curtains permanently nailed shut, so no reflective glass is exposed. I drink water from opaque matte plastic cups. I never let water pool in the kitchen sink. After heavy rain, I avoid going outside, terrified of the glassy puddles in my driveway. Because every so often, no matter how obsessively careful I am, the modern world forces a reflection on me. Walking through a hardware store and catching myself in the polished chrome bumper of a display tractor. Sitting in a diner and seeing my face in the dark tinted glass of the front door. And whenever it happens, the rational world drops away. My chest locks. My breathing stops. The heavy smell of burning ozone surges back through memory. I freeze where I stand. My muscles lock with primal panic. I stare into the glass, breath held, heart hammering wildly. And then slowly, deliberately, I begin counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I stand there perfectly still, trapped inside the cage of my own trauma, praying to a God I'm no longer even sure exists that the man staring back at me moves exactly when I do.